everybody. Really excited to talk with you all today. I brought with me a guest, Hsieh, who I've known for many, many years. And what I want to do today is do a deep dive on this idea of when or if a person should become an enablement consultant. So I've known John for many years, back when he was a practitioner, and several years ago, he transitioned into an enablement consultant. And I want to really pick John's brain on his calculation, how he decided when and how to do it, if he should do it, and what learnings he's had along the way. So, John, maybe give a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, absolutely, Dave. Pleasure to be here with you. I know you and I have been known each other for quite some time, even when you were out living out here in the West Coast. So I'm glad to hear you're going to be coming back for a race. Let's see. Gosh, I've had over 20 plus year career now, ranging quite a bit. For the past 4 years, I founded a company called Scale GTM, worked with about 20 different clients like Seismic, ClickUp, Responsive to really help scale their business. That's why we're called Scale GTM, Scale Go to Market. And fundamentally, I think for a lot of these companies, they realized what got them there isn't going to help them get there to the next set of revenue and growth ambitions. And so at the end of the day, I really help them with four very simple things. One is getting the message right. The second pillar is around deploying a tailored sales operating system. So that's a methodology or a process. Three is none of that works if we don't programmatically enable their team. So they've got to adopt these things.
Yep.
And the fourth one, which is often ignored, is activating their sales managers. So in a very sort of simple way, although it's incredibly hard to do, right? If you think about it, for most companies, if you can get the right message paired with the right methodology, adopted masterfully by the field teams, and then supported by frontline managers, those are fundamentally the ingredients to a successful business.
Nice.
So that's what I spend my day now doing. And I feel like there's so much that got me to this point. It sort of reminds me of, I've been rewatching the Game of Thrones series. And there's the famous line by Bran, which is, "You're exactly where you're supposed to be." And when I think back through my career, it's almost felt like an alphabet soup of sorts. And now when I think about what I'm doing, that quote really sort of resonates. You're exactly where you're supposed to be, John.
I love it. And when I met you, you were much younger, less hair on the face, and you're running enablement at DocuSign, and
Yeah.
it specifically when it was a relatively small team before it exploded. Maybe just spend a minute or two talking about what you did there, and then after you left there, how you then made the decision to go out on your own. What was that like?
Yeah. Yeah. So I joined DocuSign in 2012. So back then, just for context, DocuSign obviously is now a public company, multi-billion in revenue. Back in 2012, that was not the case. We were about 250 employees. I think my badge number was something like 271, like 272. I can't remember the exact number. Under 30 million in revenue, and all of that revenue was basically out of the United States. By the time I left 7 years later in 2019, close to 3,000 employees, a billion in revenue, a public company, 7 straight quarters of meeting and then raising expectations with Wall Street. So, and by the way, also revenue teams across 5 continents. So the thing, yeah. So what was so those are sort of, that's the beginning and the end. A lot happened in the middle. And I think like we can definitely dive into it more, but I had probably like 4 different like I worked in sort of 4 different functions in my 7 years at DocuSign. And I'm not just talking about titles. I'm not talking about moving from, director to VP, that kind of thing, but just 4 totally different things. And happy to dive into each of those. But I'd say sort of the common theme and what I'm really grateful for my experience at DocuSign is that, maybe probably because I joined at such an early stage, is I had the freedom and flexibility to always go run at the big problems, right? And so my job was not limited to my title. I had always had the opportunity to go and look at a big problem, go work with that team, and then eventually, if it made sense, to progress that into more of a full-time like role within the organization. And the example I'll give is When I started at DocuSign, my big goal was around messaging, and specifically messaging around mobile, right? How do you get transactions done from a mobile device? How do you do it remotely? How do you do all these things? Because that's what DocuSign was all about. And how do we message that appropriately? And in working with the sales teams, Dave, I realized there was a huge gap. And so I started working with them on the messaging and enabling them on that messaging. And before you know it, as a result of that experience, a year and a half later, all of a sudden got the head of enablement role, right? So you sort of start to, I think, when you start to run at these big problems and you work across the organization to do that, that's what gave me I think, the ability to pick up lots of different skills, improve my business acumen, play different roles, and frankly allowed me to be really excited for the entire 7 years that I was there.
And so you built this company's enablement function into a machine, a highly well-functioning machine. And at a certain point, you said you learned a lot along the way. You ran towards big problems. How did you, subsequent to that, decide, you know what? I want to strike out on my own. Like, what was that decision-making process like for you?
I think I had maybe one too many drinks one night. It is kind of a crazy decision, right? I think for people in the enablement space, it's probably something we think about a lot, right? Because if you just look at the landscape um, of consultants out there, vendors out there, there's quite a few in the enablement space, right? There's folks that there's certain methodologies that have created entire franchise businesses, right? Sandler, as an example, around this model. So it's something that I think a lot of enablers think about. So it's always been in the back of my mind. And what was really interesting is when I would talk with folks on my team, like Jeff Leslie or others, we really, like, when we were meeting our peers at other companies, what we found was that a lot of these companies, Dave, were facing the same types of problems we were facing. There's this recurring pattern, right? And so often Jeff and I would sit down and we'd talk about, hey, like, wouldn't that be interesting if we could develop a playbook that we could use over and over again for these different companies, a la some sort of business where we could go out and help a lot of different clients get across that hump as they're looking to achieve their next stage in their growth journey. So, but it's very different, right? To have that be a thought,
Yep.
like a cool, I don't know if people have these anymore, like a cooler, water cooler conversation. Maybe it's more of a
The Zoom
Slack
breakout room now.
message, yeah, Zoom conversation. Um, but it takes a lot to like make that transition. So I'll be honest. So shortly after DocSign, I went and joined another hyper growth company, which unfortunately, literally, I joined that company 3 months before the start of the pandemic in 2020, and their business sort of fell off a cliff. And sort of for the first time in my career, Dave, I found that I actually didn't have a job. It was really interesting. And so I spent the next few months, and it was a strange time. So I actually spent the next few months really just with my family. And luckily I was in a position where, I could really hunker down with my family and focus on the things that, mattered at that time. But at some point I was like, I got to get back to doing this stuff again.
Yeah.
So really it was like I was at a crossroads. And so your original question is like, how did I decide from DocSign all the way to starting my own business? It was like these series of factors that finally I said, hey, it's time to take that water cooler conversation and start to make that a reality. And so that sort of went, in some ways, I think it's very, I guess, you were exactly where you're supposed to be in many ways. So had I not left DocuSign at that time, had I not joined this startup, which then was disrupted by the pandemic, had I not, I think if I was in a job, it'd be very difficult to all of a sudden decide to go independent. So in some ways, a lot of that decision was made for me.
And as you think about that, I guess, you in theory could have found another DocuSign, another thing that's in a hyper growth mode and done that. And you could have done that. How did you decide now is the time? Because I think for a lot of folks who are in the same position, they're like, I want to do this someday. Being not having a job aside, like, how did you decide this was that day? This is the time where I want to go on my own versus going back in house.
Yeah. Yeah. Fundamentally, when you become, for me, like by the way, I do have ambitions of growing the business one day, bringing on a bigger team, but I knew back then for the foreseeable future that I was going to have to go at it alone for a
Yeah.
while. Buck stops with me, right? And so I think couple things. I think number one, we talked a little bit of my experience at DocSign and sort of everything that led to that. I felt like the first thing was like I felt like I had amassed enough experiences across growth companies where I could go and run at a problem, okay, and help companies solve that problem. So in many ways, I felt like, hey, when I start this business, I didn't need to like find one very specific thing that I could go and focus to help people on. I felt like, hey, if I was able to have a conversation with a CRO, a CMO, a CEO at a hyper growth company, that like in that conversation, something would come up that I would be able to help with. Right. And that was my premise number one. And then my premise number two was like anything I think in life, I sort of created a plan around this. And what I said was, um, rewind to 2020. So when I finally made this decision, so it was in September of 2020 is when I decided, hey, I'm going to do this. And what I said was, hey, by the end of the year, I set some targets for myself. I
Okay.
wanted to have at least my one client. I want to have one client. But beyond that, I wanted to make sure that I had a pipeline, that I was having enough conversations and there was enough interest in my premise that if I could have this conversation with the right people, that they would present a problem and I'd be able to help them to solve that problem, right? Maybe we didn't sign the
Yep.
deal yet, but I wanted to have that pipeline. And so those are sort of the two things. Like I had a plan, sort of a
Yep.
timeline for myself, one client and that. And then number two, I felt pretty good about, I think part of the challenge of starting your own business, like where do you start? And for me, I think where I start, I decided, hey, like where I start was going to be around like confidence in my ability to help these people solve a problem. I don't exactly know what that problem is, right? I'm not going to build it. I'm not going to build my website saying, here are the 3 services that I
Yep.
offer. But it was really around that. So those are the 2 big things.
And it's funny, I'm going to pull on both of those threads because I think there's a lot of good stuff in there. The first thread is, and you sort of touched on this, but I want to I want to go a little bit deeper. Is what did you? Yes, you're having conversations with executives to solve big problems, but did you position yourself in a certain way, or you were just I'm an enablement consultant, a generalist, or did you have any specific niches within that where you said I specialize in X, Y, and Z?
Yeah. So first is like, it's funny, like I feel like now I don't feel like I'm teaching a bunch of salespeople like how to like reach their target market, but essentially like that's what we're doing for ourselves, right? When we decide to go independent. So the first thing was I knew that I wasn't going to win business with a 4,000 person company at the 1 billion revenue mark, right? Like while I had gotten DocSign to that point, my experience was not getting DocSign from 1 billion to 2 or 3 or 4, etc.
Yeah.
So being very realistic about where my sweet spot is, right? And so for me, that was helping companies get from 10 million to 50, from 50 to 200, and 200 to a billion. So that in of itself is quite a large swath as well.
Yeah.
So that's the first thing. The sort of the next thing I really thought about is, I mean, the the I kind of keep going back to this same, the reason why I'm pausing here is I keep kind of going back to the same thing, right? For example, like Dave, if you came to me and you said, hey, like I'm looking to expand my business, right? The very first conversation I would have with is you, what's preventing you from doing that today, right? Where are your gaps?
Yep.
So one of the early companies I talked with, ClickUp as an example, was a PLG type company, but they had started expanding, but they wanted to, and so they had reps that were very good at sort of taking people through the product, right? Because people, essentially the motion was, I'd try the product, I'd use it, I'd run into some issue about how to use it, I would call in, a rep would pick up, they would teach them how to use it, and then try to sell them more, right?
Mm.
Exactly. Something along those lines. But the problem was the sell them more part. And so at that point, ClickUp was a much smaller organization. I think in 2021, they ended up raising another $400 million, really expanded. But their problem was, look, and they didn't share this information with me. They were probably well on their way to like raising that money and growth expansion. But what they shared with me was, we've got to expand the foundations of what we're doing right now. Like,
Yep.
we're starting to add more people to our sales organization right now. They're really, right now our entire enablement program is around training people on the product, but not on the sales part. And so that was their challenge. And so I helped them tackle that particular challenge, right? And what positioned me to do that again is the fact that I can draw on, whether it was my experience at DocuSign or somewhere else, like, you know, there's probably like a dozen different things that he could have brought up that I could have
Yeah.
that I've dealt and faced with before. So that breadth of experience I think was really helpful, if you will. So it's true classic sales. Identify what the problem is,
Yep.
where pain points are, and then talk about success stories I've had in the past to help them, that's been able to help along the way.
Yep.
Then ultimately talk about what that solution might look like for them.
So I take your point of you had a niche of making them grow fast, getting to where DocuSign was. And so you weren't targeting GE, you were targeting these hyper growth, smaller ones. So you sort of had a finite list of size and type of companies that you were targeting. And then, so that was your somewhat of a niche in terms of that. And then you're also trying to have, sounds like, senior level, executive level conversations for big problems to run towards as to solve, not
Yeah.
re-indexing their content management tool and like not doing that stuff. And then, but then as you started, so the shingle was hung, we were like October or so of 2020, whenever that was, like you said, I'm doing this thing. How did you get the first client? Like, just walk people through step by step. You had a plan, great, and then you had to execute on it. So how did you just get very tactical? Because again, if somebody wants to start a business, like they want to understand, steps 1 through 4. So like, how did you just start cold calling people? Did you email blast? Were you leveraging your network? Like, how did you get the momentum going to get started?
Yeah, I think the network is huge, right? And so um, the very first thing I did, I remember, was I did this LinkedIn blog post, and I actually went and it's kind of, it was this combination of, I wanted to let people know this is the direction I was headed, but I also wanted to let them know why, why this was the direction I was heading. And so I talked a little bit about things that happened in my career and
Yeah.
people that helped influence those decisions. And I mentioned those people directly in the
Mhm.
LinkedIn article as well. In a very, obviously we did that to get more eyeballs on it, but also in a very genuine way. Like, these were people that made a huge impact in my career. And obviously was also, there were too many to list, but I listed the few that I thought would really help people understand why I decided to go this path and then the value that I could provide. And so that article set off a series of, number one, really fun, like reconnecting with people in the past. Highly recommend you do that just to reconnect with your network. But from there, I think I had, in my 25 plus years of experience, the reputation I've been able to build over time, I got the CEO of a company that I'd worked with previously actually reached out and said, "Hey, John, like," and in fact, here's what he said to me. "Hey, John, from working with you in the past, I know you can help with a lot of different stuff. And I'm a small company and I need help with lots of different stuff.
Yeah.
So let's have a conversation about, the one or two things you could potentially jump in and help with."
Okay. So your LinkedIn post got some former people that you'd work with reconnecting with you, and that became client one.
Yeah.
What about like 2 and 3 and 4? Was it more of the same of like other former people who work with you directly? Anybody indirect who just read the post and said, "Sounds like a smart dude, I want to work with him"? Any of that happen?
All the early intros were from people that I knew in my network.
Okay.
Yeah, so my client number 2 was the former head of recruiting at DocuSign, had started his own recruiting agency.
Yeah.
Was talking with client number 2, talking with ClickUp about some things. ClickUp was looking to hire and source a bunch of different areas, and they just happened to ask him, "Hey, do you know any like enablement people?" And so he's like, "Yeah, I know this guy, John. It's nice enough to go ahead and introduce me." And then I met the sales leader at ClickUp. Now, the good news is, once I met the sales leader at ClickUp, and this has happened over and over again, it's those, like that second degree connection that's then referred me to the next person, and so on and so forth. Because I think that is a really important point. At some point, and I've heard this number when I first started, which is like your own network. If you have a really strong network, your own network is probably good enough for about 18 months, year and a half. But so many reasons why solopreneurs don't continue past that year and a half mark is they don't continue to expand that network. Right. And so I've knocked on wood, I've been very fortunate. I'm about to hit my 4-year milestone here. And I think one of the reasons why is I've been able to take advantage both of my first tier network, but then also as I've worked with clients, they've then introduced me to other folks as well. But word of mouth referrals really been the biggest business development activity for me.
Yeah, and I'll add in a couple notes here because as I talk to a lot of folks who are going out on their own, I think you're making the very important point and almost like a decision-making criteria for somebody of, do I do this, and if so, when? And my strong observation from working with people over the years is, if you have a track record and a network that is strong, it is infinitely easier to be successful than if you don't. And maybe that sort of seems common sense, but just because you're good at your job and you can do great work doesn't mean you have what it takes to get the flywheel moving, right? Because you had some success, more introductions, that flywheel got momentum and kept going. And if John Hsieh 15 years ago with the network he had then, or 10 years ago, it would have been probably a lot harder for you to have the success that you have had. And not to mention the more logos. I work for DocuSign, I work for this other company, like those things help you too. But I think when people go out on their own earlier and without a robust connection to people who know and trust you and are willing to say, "Hey, I want to hire this person," it's a lot harder. And so I always think about, when I coach and counsel people, it's like, do you have a network who, when you make that post, they're like, "Hey, I want to hire you now. I've got stuff. I've got projects." And I think that's an important thing to keep in mind, because you've you're no spring chicken. You've had some experiences. And so I think that's allowed you to be successful in launching Scale GTM because you have had those things. And then when you got it going, people started to follow you and want to be take advantage of what you have there. So
I'm definitely no spring chicken.
not to point that out and make you feel really awkward,
You know
but
what you said about like trust is
yeah,
absolutely right? Which is at the end of the day, this is like a trust business, and in the fact that like I'm able to leverage my first degree to get referrals to the second degree, to then become my first and just rinse, repeat over and over again is huge. The second thing, like what you just said, Dave, really like prompted me to think about the other thing, which is one of the lessons I learned early on is it matter who I talked with,
mhm,
right? So, um, as a small business, right? So a lot of times we're enabling. When I was in the enablement function at DocuSign, our sales transactions, on the small business side was 30 days, on the enterprise side, many months, right? And when I think about my own business, I don't have the luxury of like doing a 6-month, 9-month sales cycle, right? It's because I'm trying to execute on the work as well, frankly, right? My sole job is not to sell. In fact, I think my sole job is to help companies execute on these engagements. And so so this goes back to the point, like who do you think is going to be the buyer of your services? And does your network consist of those people? Right.
yes,
And so, and in my case, the buyer of my services, the person that's looking at these big problems to solve are CMOs, CROs, and in some cases, in smaller organizations, it's CEOs who are very sales oriented,
sure.
right? And so that's the other thing you should, I think, for folks who are considering this, they should really think about this, which is not that I have 5,000 connections on LinkedIn, but like, who are those connections? And are those people potentially my target buyer? Are they the economic buyer? Do they have the purse string? Are those the people with the budget?
And I'll add on top of that, I think the important thing that people have to be honest with themselves about is, are they comfortable talking to those people and asking them for the business? Because certain people, especially more junior sellers, they're not comfortable with the executive conversations and calling high, and they kind of bristle at that. And enablement folks haven't always had to do that. And so I think to your point, if your economic buyer is this C-suite, CMO, CEO, CRO, if you don't feel comfortable talking to those people and having that level of conversation, maybe it's not your time yet, because for most folks, I think those will be the economic buyers for enablement services.
Yeah, I'll give you another example, right? So in January of this year, I got a new client, worked directly with the CEO. It's a healthcare software company. So worked with their CEO, develop new messaging. So they're looking to ramp up their sales hiring. They want to make sure everyone is on point in terms of how they message, how they do discovery, how they talk about the pain, that leads to the solution, etc. Um, the we ended up prepping one of the so signing the CEO, we did the work. She really wanted to get the board exposed to this new messaging. And so we both collaboratively came up with the idea, why don't we train one of the sales reps to deliver this message at a board meeting rather than me showing up and doing that, right? So kill two birds with one stone. We train the sales rep. That sales rep becomes a champion of that message. Board gets excited, etc. Anyway, so did that with one of the sales reps. Sales reps went to the board meeting, absolutely crushed it. She did a fantastic job. I did a bunch of coaching sessions with that rep to get her to that point. And then next thing I know, their board one of the members of their board reached out to me. She's runs another company, said, "Hey, John, we're going through something similar at my company. Would you mind, can you have a conversation with me and my co-founder?" Right. And, a few weeks later, that engagement gets signed,
Yeah.
and we're about to kick that off, actually starting Monday of
That's
next.
great. Congrats on that.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
So,
But to your point, like this for, as a small business, like I often think about one of the keys to my success is I have to be able to transact quickly, right? I mean, I have to be able to get that engagement quickly because I can't run a 9 month sales cycle. And for me, that means having these CEO or board level discussions and then saying things that will resonate with them.
yeah.
And so I think that's been a key pillar, one of the key pillars to my success so far.
And as the business started to take off, maybe 3.5 years ago, when you started to realize, all right, there's something here. Any big surprises, good or bad, of like, didn't expect that?
Um, one thing, one thing that I'm really pleasantly surprised by, and this has really helped my pipeline, is that I have probably like 75%, maybe even more, I should run the math on it, have ended up extending their engagements with me. When I first started, I was like thinking, okay, I'm going to do a 3 month engagement with a client. Maybe best case scenario, a year, after I finish that piece, maybe 6 months later or a year later, they come back and do another one.
Yeah.
I've actually had multiple clients, the large majority that say like, wow, John, thank you for the work in 3 months. We were not only able to, you know, um, by the way, 3 months is really important. That's the other thing,
Yep.
since I talk about 3 months. I try to scope most of my engagements to 3 months. And that's because when we're working with sales groups, like one of the big things I talk about is like driving impact, like within a quarter's time, right? I think most CROs don't have the luxury, if you're working with a very large, consulting shop, and maybe by definition, they've got a lot of people they need to feed at that company. The business model is they want to sell you a 6 month engagement, maybe a lot of follow-on work. For me, like my business model is I want to help you. I don't have, this is the only mouth I need to feed besides, my dog who's not in the background here, my family. But the it's like for me, I really focus on how do I help you drive impact in 3 months worth of time, right? And so that's why I thought most of my engagements would be 3 months. But the big surprise is like after that 3 months and you prove value, and especially for the size of company I'm going after, they're always under resourced. They have bigger ambition, they have huge ambitions, and they want to do more.
Yeah.
And so once I've gone in and established that credibility, a lot of these 3 month engagements have turned into year-long plus engagements. So that's a very like pleasant surprise that's happened
And,
a lot.
and John, on that point, the things you did after the 3 months, were those things that were discussed up front? You're like, we'll back burner those and maybe we'll get to them, or were they learned throughout the 3 months and then they brought them to you at the end of the 3 months? Like, how did that happen?
Yeah, it's some combination of all of these things. So typically what I'll do is I'll scope something in the beginning. It'll be very I don't like the scope isn't about like sales transformation. It's not that big. It's like, hey, we've got to deploy MedPick, right?
Mhm.
People forecast is all over the place. People don't really know where they are in the deal. We need skills to improve that. Great. Like, let's get the right qualification framework in place. So it's very focused on that. Now that might have multiple pieces. It might start with, hey, let's do a quick analysis around what parts of MedPick are going to be most important. Medic is going to be most important to you. Should we roll that out, across the board, or should we target one team? So there might be like different phases in that piece. But as I'm working with that team and working with the CRO on that, they might say, what I find is typically there'll be other challenges and issues that come along the way.
Yeah.
And at that point, you become a trusted advisor. So that's the other thing about my business models. I never worked with more than 2 to 3 clients at a time. So it's a very high touch model. And so I'm spending a lot of time in the organization understanding their challenges.
And it's funny, I think a lot of folks, when they start, maybe they have a layoff, maybe they want to just try this consulting thing. They get a client, maybe they have 2 clients. How did you know when your business went from a couple random smattering of clients to getting over the hump to become a sustainable business? Like what was that moment for you?
I'm still waiting for that moment. I think as I don't know about you, Dave, but for me, I'm like this angst of like, oh my gosh, what's gonna happen like
Right.
tomorrow is always like, so by the way, if you're wanting to try this, just be aware, at least for me anyway, I'm now 4 years in, this like, I obviously I'm uh, generating a good revenue stream out of this. It's a business for me. I'm able to feed my dog and my family.
In that order.
But but this feeling of like, oh my God, it might all go away tomorrow, never leaves. Um, does it? I don't know. Do you feel that way?
Yeah, it definitely it's something that you don't forget. And I think part of what's hard, and one of the things I talk about with a lot of folks who are considering this is, they'll make the mistake of they'll doing short engagements. Maybe it's a month, maybe it's even 2 months. And then what I always say is, if you don't have longer engagements, you're always, or don't have multiple ones stacked on top of each other, you're always chasing the next gig. And so all of a sudden you're like, you want to work on this project that the client's paying you for, but you're like, this project ends March 31st. I've got to now like find my next client. And so you become, you start to work around the clock sometimes, because you're at night, you're like, I got to find my next client while I'm billing during the day, and becomes this difficult thing. You're always chasing. And I think, what you said really resonates of, you want to have longer term engagements that allow you the flexibility not to be chasing all the time. And then if you can have multiple ones at the same time and stack projects on top of each other, that becomes a way to have, you're mitigating the risk of having one big client who might go away, and then you're left with like scraps. And so I
Yeah.
think it's it never goes away. And I think part of the calculus that a person must have is, am I okay with uncertainty? Am I okay with a little bit of paranoia? And like, what's going to happen if that feeling, for most of us, as long as you're realistic, it doesn't go away, and you have to be okay with that lifestyle. Because it has pros, right? When it's good, it's good. When it's not as good, it's not as good. And you have lifestyle flexibility. But that way of living, that uncertainty, is not okay for everyone.
Yeah, there's definitely a season, like for example, what I've discovered is there's seasonality to my business as well.
Yeah.
So, as you can imagine, people are really focused on improving their go-to-market engine, their sales teams, etc. Sort of at the beginning of every year, there's a big focus on that. So roughly like December to March tends to be incredibly busy for me. Um, and then things start to pick up again, like just after mid-year. So now they've gone through 6 months of their plan, and they need
Yeah.
to they understand where the gaps are, and they need to make some final adjustments. Right. And so then we see sort of, and so that's really helped me relieve some of the angst, knowing that like there's the seasonality
Right.
of
Yeah.
business. I think the other thing that helps me drive longer term like extensions of engagement, because I think it's hard to like, it's very easy for a client to say like, wow, like John's like, yes, I believe John can help us with this, and I'm willing to sign a 3-month contract with John. I think that like I think it'd be a different story if I was like, hey, this is actually a 9-month contract that you have to sign right up front. Right. So I think like 3 months for me at least has been a sweet spot to start. But the way I position myself, again, like what you're like, I run to the problem. I talk a lot about that, sort of like my breadth of experience. I think then they don't pigeonhole me to that one specific area.
Mm.
But now the next problem comes along, then great, like John had, I seem to recall you talked about this. Do you have experience in this area? Absolutely. This is what I did, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, so I think that's really helped with a lot of the when I have help me extend my shorter term
Yeah.
contracts into longer term engagements.
And I think it goes without saying, but you successfully completed your deliverables in the 3 months. they didn't slip. So meaning that allowed you the credibility, the trust to then them come back to you for other additional projects versus I told them 3 months and now it's taking more like 5 or 6 months. Like that's a scope creep, or that's where it's slipping. That's harder to extend that because then they're like,
Yeah.
we missed it. So you're not only you're running towards the big problems, you're running fast and
Yeah.
trying to solve them fast to allow you the credibility, the trust to then take that next project or extend or expand.
Yeah. Yeah. And which actually leads me to this other thing I've been thinking about, which is, so far we've been helping people understand sort of some of the things to look out for. I will say, like, one of the greatest outcomes or joys of having now done this for the past 4 years is when you can focus on a finite set of problems, right? So no more than 2 to 3 clients, a big challenge at that client at a time. So I'm not context switching like I used to as much. I'm very focused on solving this. My levels of creativity and productivity have just gone through the roof.
Interesting.
2x, 3x, 4x. And so for me personally, it's just like, it's from that perspective, it's been so rewarding. And I spent a lot of my career thinking like, hey, like my goal to solve a problem, but then I want to build a team and I want to build a bigger team, and then I want a bigger title across bigger teams and bigger scope. And my job is very different now, right? Like I'm in many ways, like I'm an individual contributor. And so the last thing I would say is like, you've got to love doing the work. And what I found in this process is like the work that I'm doing, I love doing it. I love executing it. The fact that I get to focus allows me to be more creative. I'm incredibly productive. My clients are grateful. They've prioritized that work. So I'm not trying to, pitch that work isn't, they've already prioritized it. I'm not trying to like sell it internally in their organization across all these different departments, like back in my enablement days in role. And so from that perspective, it's been very, very rewarding. And so that's one of the big reasons why like I'm willing to deal with the angst and all this other kind of stuff. Like I feel like it's just uh yeah, for me it's been really exciting. So I think that's probably, in this vein of like what else should you be looking for?
Yeah.
You've got to ask yourself the question like if you're someone that's fair now, let's say you're like fairly senior and you decide to do this, like are you willing to actually like roll up your sleeves and
Right.
do the work
And love it
and love it?
versus be resentful about it. One tangent I want to ask about that I hadn't really thought about until something you just said. I think a lot of folks who go to do this, frankly, it's because they're sick of the BS, the corporate BS. Like I'm sick
Mhm.
of this, the culture and all the stuff there. I want to be able to kind of float in and out. And and I think sometimes that's avoiding the problem in some ways because that exists everywhere. But when you do what you do, you're not an employee. No one has to listen to you.
Yeah,
How do you go in there and be effective and get stuff done when you're just a hired gun? You don't work there. How do you bridge that gap to become somebody that they listen to?
yeah. I think that's why it's even more important that like as if you're an enablement practitioner, that you feel like navigating the organization, your influence within that organization over people that don't report to you or are not even part of your department. Like if you're not good at that at some level, if you're going into consulting to say like, hey, I'm gonna relieve myself of all of those things, I think that's the wrong mindset,
Yeah.
right? But you're gonna struggle because I think as a consultant going in, nobody reports to you. No one's a part of your department. Uh, they all have 30 things on their plate that they need to do. And so that problem that you had in the corporate world continues to exist when you go out on your own. Now, I think like and so so for me, the benefit I get is oftentimes because one thing we talked about, like we're talking at the CEO, CMO, CRO level, at least these are like executive leadership supported initiatives,
Yep.
right? But at the end of the day, um, I'll give you another example. Like one of my clients right now, responsive. What I'm really proud of is that I work so close, because these are very high touch engagements, and I work so close. Obviously, I have a great relationship with the leadership team, but I also work so closely with the teams, the sellers, the frontline managers, that they without me soliciting for this, they'll actually like say like, hey, like John was great to work with from, they'll say that to their CRO, to their CMO, etc. And so I think long story, sorry, my answers are so long, dude.
It's okay. This is a long form conversation, so it's not about sound bites. So keep
Yeah.
going. This is fine.
Yeah. So I think if you're thinking like you're gonna get into consulting to escape all of that, I would say you're gonna have there's once you open the curtain, you're in for a bit of a shock. And you have to somewhat, it's different, but you do have to be able to relish it, be successful in that environment, and in fact, if you probably have to be even better at it than you were before from many
I, I
respects.
I think that's right. And so you were saying a minute ago, part of what you love and you like so much of the job and doing the work and the projects you're on. So just some real talk for a second here. What parts of it are just a grind? You're like, this part of the job sucks. What is that for you?
Yeah. Um, so couple of things. There definitely is like an initial hump hurdle in setting up your own business. And so there's a lot of like administrative stuff related to the business itself. Although with with SaaS and all of that kind of, you're able to buy software, you got to find the right the accountant, bookkeeper, etc. Dave's smiling because you know all about this stuff. So I would say that's one. But I think totally, in fact, my sister, about 2 years, she started her own business like 2 years after I did. And she was asking me about all the things like I did to set up my business. And she was like, seemed overwhelmed by it. And I said, don't worry about it. Like step by step, you'll get there.
Yeah.
That's one. The grind, the grind to me, for me personally, because I love doing the work, right? Like I find that I could easily spend like 100% of my week doing the work. And I have to remind myself like there's a there's that sales there's a business development component of continuing this thing. And so what that means for me is lifting up, anyway, so I think that's, I've got to continue to remind myself that like that component never goes away.
Yep.
And I guess if you're not into doing the work, that could be the grind. But to me, I actually like that, I'm so excited. Like I love what I do, but it's a lot. Like I love doing the work because, like for a lot, I, I I love interviewing reps to get their insights. I love taking those insights and like creating a framework, like finding patterns and creating a framework. I love taking all of that and tactically putting it into a sales deck with slides. I'm not a great designer, so occasionally I'll either I have a designer that I work with, but I love working with the designer
Yeah.
on iterations of the visual things on that slide. I love taking that deck and having it get beat up on and making it better. I love rolling it out to people and coaching people on it. I love following up with them to figure out how to make it better. And so I think you've got to like, for me, that I don't consider that the grind, but
Yeah.
like, but I can imagine like there's no team, like this is it. And of course you're partnering with your client, But for me, I think the grind is what I love, and I think you have to be excited about that grind.
I love how many times you said the word love when describing your job. I think it's great
Uh,
that's the situation you put yourself in. And just, I want to go down this slight detour for a second here. We'll come back to something. So we were talking much earlier in the conversation of you going alone. It was just you. You want to see if it was a business. A lot of folks, the old adage of you want to go fast, go alone. You want to go far, go with somebody else, have a partner. And so I think for some folks, there's a decision of, do I go alone or do I partner with somebody? And any putting yourself aside for a second, any thoughts on that for a person looking to start this up?
yeah, there's a couple ways you can start independently, right? I think my path sort of requires sort of that I don't know, for lack of a better word, sort of that requires conversations at that executive level. There's a number of people who go alone that take more of a staff augmentation approach, right? So there's plenty of enablement companies out there that are looking to, and so consulting companies out there that are looking to place someone in a job for 3 months, more of a staff aug approach.
Yeah.
So, but that's not what I wanted to do. Like that feels like just a temp kind of job. There's definitely value in that, and people who do that, that's fantastic. They make entire careers out of that. They work company to company. They don't have to source that work. There's like someone over them that does all that sourcing, but your earning potential is severely limited, right? Because what happens is, it's just in theory, let's say they source you out at $100 an hour. Of course, that company is going to take a certain percentage, and then you're probably going to be left with, 50, 60% of that, right? So there's going to be, and you're always at the whim of someone else placing
Yeah.
you. So I think the model really, like the business model, that is one thing to think about, like, is beyond just can I get clients? Like, what is the business model that you're going to operate under? And it's not like it's not super complex, but what are you going to charge? How are you going to charge that? What amount? Are you going to do 3-month contracts? Are you going to do 6-month contracts? Are you going to do
Hourly, are
staff
you
hog? Are
project
you going to do
based?
hourly? Are you going to invoice? How are you going to? And so, yeah. And so it's because if you invoice hourly, like what's your hourly invoice rate? Because then now they're like, right, like consulting companies do fixed bid projects where they never tell you what the hourly rate is. It's more of like for 3 months they've estimated something, because if they actually told you the hourly rate, you'd be like, no way, I wouldn't pay that. Or I think the other way to think, anyway, so I think, yeah, there's different models. For me personally, like I do a very outcomes focused model because I always want it to be about the value that we deliver,
Yeah.
that I deliver. So yeah, I think these are all really,
And I know I've seen some people have the model of person A focuses on business development, person B more does the projects. And there's no right or wrong. The only thing I would say is what I've seen people say before is we've worked together over the years. We 3 different companies, we work together so well and we're a great team. But what I would argue is if you're going back to our conversation earlier, if you think of the Venn diagram of your connections and their connections, if they're almost concentric, they overlap a lot, not as good as if you have two very different worlds, because you both can bring in more connections to help drive the business forward. So I would think about a person with if you're going to have a partner with a diverse set of connections and backgrounds, because that doubles almost,
yeah,
who you get to talk to and the kinds of things you can work on.
yeah, I think that's really helpful. But then if you think like one thing I'll say is, the reason why people engage with me is because of me. Like they want to work with me. They don't want to
Yeah.
like, they don't want to work with like some junior person. So
Right.
then the way I would grow my business is by hiring like working with another me, right? And maybe they have a different network, but then what's the business model for that? Like that other me will, like, how does that expand the pie? And it doesn't, like, so these are sort of the things you grapple with, that I'm grappling with now, is like when I do think about expanding, I don't think it's just hiring another partner, because now we just basically divide the revenue in half. I could have done that without the
Right.
having done the extra work of a partner. So I think that
Times two divided by two is the same number.
that's right. Times two divided by two is still the same. That's exactly right. So
Uh,
I think these are some of the challenges as you move forward in this business.
and I guess to wrap it up, I guess we've talked about a lot. We've had this is a nice long form conversation. I guess to summarize a little bit, how would you coach somebody? What's the calculus? How do they decide if and when? Like how would you summarize it for somebody if they said, "Hey, John, I'm thinking about it. What do you think?"
I think like first thing is I think you've got to be a it's really important to understand who the buyer of your service is going to be. And then without like everyone that I've ever talked to, like when I first starting out and now when people are reaching out to me, hey, how do you start this thing? Like it's almost always dependent on your current network, right? So I think you've got to find a map, like you have to be realistic with yourself about like the type of influence you would have over buyers in your network. So that's the first thing. The second thing is I feel like I've had a pretty unique experience. Like my business has been very smooth and up and to the right, and I've not really experienced a dip yet. Knock on wood.
Very good.
But that's not like when I talk to others, that's not the experience that I hear from others. So I think you should be willing and able to be able to handle those dips. I think you want to understand your personal sort of financial and ability to be able to handle those dips. You shouldn't like and I definitely so for me that was like, hey, I'm gonna have this 6-month plan, one target, one client, multiple conversations, etc. So all of that. And then the third thing is you've got to feel like to me, and by the way, that part of that plan is if it doesn't work out in 6 months, what am I going to do then? And I had enough confidence that I could get back into the corporate
Yeah.
world if I needed to. And then the third thing I think we've talked about, the calculus, is you've got to love to do the work.
Mm.
Right. So let's say you're 15 years in and you're a manager, and you've got a team of 3 to 4 people, and you spend 20% of your time now doing the work, but 80% of the time, managing the team and talking to the rest of the organization. Like, are you willing to like flip that equation? Are you willing to spend 80% of your time now executing on all of that work? And can you execute on all of that work? So I think there's probably so much more, but those are sort of the top 3 things
Yeah.
that come to mind.
And would you ever go back in house? Is that ever in the cards or not really?
Never say never. I've had many clients offer that opportunity to me, which I'm very flattered and thankful for. Um, but I'm having worked 20, I say 20, it's actually, I think this is my 25th year, if that's right, of working. You know, I I've made like for me, like my career has never been like, hey, I want to have this title or this role. It's always been like, I love running at problems and figuring out how to solve them. I've been lucky enough at companies that have given me that flexibility.
Yeah.
And like literally, that's what I do now for a living. I run at priority problems that people already recognize as a priority. And I get to do that. So it's hard. It would take something pretty traumatic for me to return to the I'll never say never, but like you said, I've used the word love quite a few times. I don't know that. Um, anyway, yeah.
Not
So
that common.
doing and
Um,
yeah.
John, thank you for sharing. I think we picked your brain. I picked your brain for a while and really wanted to flesh out this topic, just given how many folks are entertaining the idea, sometimes by choice, sometimes not by choice. And I think there's a lot of good nuggets in here that you shared. So thank you so much for sharing all that with everybody.
You bet, Dave. It's a pleasure talking to you, and good luck to everyone. I know if you're thinking about it, it's a big decision. I recommend, go talk to other people that have done it. have a personal conversation. But at the end of the day, I think it requires a lot of self-reflection. So
Exactly right.
if you decide it's the right thing, there's definitely some incredible, it can be some incredible outcomes on the other end of that.
Sounds good. All right. Thanks, everybody.